Hello and welcome to episode 5 of my Kerbal Space Program NASA series, the reboot. This episode took a little longer than I was planning to get out. Been fighting a lot of technical issues in 64-bit, which I have thrown in the towel and surrendered. We've transitioned everything over to 64-bit, which means I've got to run active texture compression, or transferred over to 32-bit. I'm not ready to just out and out blame 64-bit Kerbal Space Program because I am using a lot of mods that have not been updated in a while. Well, not a lot, just a few. And so I'm holding off on final judgment on 64-bit. It is naturally more unstable than 32-bit, but I was running into a lot of issues. It seemed like it really wanted to keep throwing memory allocation errors with environmental visual enhancements, which I'm still using the 32-bit version of. So, but we're bringing our first Gemini crew back. The after mission report. And since we have another perfectly good spacecraft already up in orbit, decided to put them to work and gain some high above Kerbin space science. And that blue orbit marker you're seeing is part of a new mod I've integrated into this playthrough called Fine Print. I'll go into a little more detail on it later. I'm just going to bring it up now to say that's what you're seeing. So they get up to high altitude and start taking all sorts of sciencey observations. I really, really love how clean you can make your ships look with D-Magic Orbital Science universal storage parts. Everything just looks so much nicer. I'm going to go around collecting the data from all the instruments before returning back to the vessel. Really nice view of Kerbin there. Yeah, in addition to switching over to 32-bit, I am actually also starting a new job at the end of, or beginning of next month. I'm transitioning to a more of a full-time schedule at school, hoping to just burn through my degree as fast as I can at this point. So I'll be working more part-time, which I will technically have more time to play Kerbal Space Program, which I have had absolutely none in the past week or so. Just everything's been really hectic trying to arrange all that. But homework will take precedence over everything, and I'm pursuing a pretty technical degree, so there's going to be plenty of homework. But it's the type of environment I just absolutely love and thrive in. So, and I had to do a couple more contracts to fulfill this fine print contract, which is an aerial survey over these waypoints you see. And it's kind of a boring flight, but it's a pretty good illustration of one of the new contracts in fine print, which it was actually fun to fly. It's more of a sightseeing tour around Kerbin. But I had to do some development contracts to unlock the turbojet to build this aircraft, which really resembles the McDonnell Douglas F3 Demon. It was unintentional, but as far as my aircraft design, the 60s are in full swing. And the F3 is like the less famous precursor to the more famous F4 Phantom. It wasn't the best aircraft in the world. In fact, the Navy kind of hated it because it was single engine. One of the objections they're having with the current F-35, they really prefer having the redundancy of a second engine if you're going to be flying over miles and miles of featureless ocean. But we fly around over these waypoints, and as you get closer, it logs your altitude, and if you're within certain parameters, and you complete that leg of the mission. You can see the aurora hanging over Kerbin's ice caps. It's not an exceptionally difficult thing to do. You just have to have an aircraft. You can do this in multiple flights. I just didn't have the patience for it, and I really doubt there's many people who do. So I built this aircraft as best I could, and Honestly, the efficiency, the high altitude efficiency of that turbojet is pretty broken as far as gain balance goes. But pre-alpha balancing will come later. Or I'm sorry, alpha. We're out of pre-alpha. Balancing that'll come later, because you can see I'm flying pretty much halfway around the world and it's just sipping that one tank. I actually grew pretty fond of this little airplane. Slapped it together in just a couple minutes and it flies pretty decently. I have not unlocked procedural wings yet, so just sticking with what squad gives me. Make a return approach at night. And it's not an obscene amount of science. It's 11 points per waypoint, so it keeps it pretty balanced. You got to work for it. It's not like some of the other tests where you can get hundreds and hundreds of points. But now with Gemini having pretty much served its purpose, there's a bunch of other Gemini flights I could recreate just for the sake of recreating them, but I've pretty much reached the limit of what it can do usefully. So we are prepping for Apollo. And this little probe is more analogous to, say, to the Luna series probes sent out by the Soviet Union, which I think it was Luna 6 or 5. I don't recall. But I know one of the early Luna probes was the first to make a soft landing on the moon. Most of the earlier ones sent out by both NASA and the Soviet Union were just impactor probes sent to fly as quickly as possible into the surface of the moon. But some of the later Luna probes were much more ambitious. And in fact, I believe it was Luna 15 that was supposed to be a sample return mission, and it was interesting. A little bit of history on it was it actually met the Apollo spacecraft in orbit around the moon, not within visual distance, it's just they were both orbiting the moon at the same time. And it's one of the earliest incidences of cooperation between NASA and the Russian Space Agency, or Soviet Space Agency, I'm sorry, in that the Soviets warned NASA that they had a probe in the area to eliminate the risk of a collision between it and Apollo 11. And when the first, much earlier in 1966, well, 3 years earlier, in 1966, when the first Luna probe that made a soft landing came down, the Soviet Space Agency actually did not want to release the video and photos taken from the lunar surface. However, and there's speculation this was done intentionally, the signal format that the probe used to send the data back to Earth was the universally agreed standard for transmitting newspaper data. And so a newspaper in England was able to intercept and decode and put the images out before pretty much cutting the Soviet government out of the decision-making loop. And likewise, this is our first soft landing on the moon. I initially intended this to be a return mission, as you can see by the parachutes, but I have a nasty habit of drastically underestimating delta V for my probes. I can do pretty good on manned missions for some reason, but when it comes time to land probes, I'm all over the place. Yeah, that was very optimistic of me, seeing as it came down on fumes. There's no way this thing was coming back. And I realized that I had actually jumped the gun a little and hadn't actually accepted the contract for exploring the moon. So, hop back here and quickly accept it before bouncing back to the probe on the surface of the moon. Min. M umlaut N, not double O. And retroactively, I'm awarded the Lunar Orbit ribbon or contract. That's a little malfunction in the smoke screen mod. You shouldn't be seeing that in a vacuum, but quick boost off and return so I can get the landing on the moon milestone. And then just begins kind of a tedious task of collecting and transmitting data, which once again the dmagic orbital science parts integrated with universal storage really help make nice compact probes that are not so awkward to try and bring down. Which, if you're playing in stock aerodynamics and you asparagus stage everything, it doesn't matter what your stuff looks like. In fact, I've seen most of the stuff that comes out of stock aerodynamics usually ranks a little higher on the creativity scale than the things I normally see flying with Ferrum, especially the stuff I do. And I don't use procedural fairings. I used to be absolutely obsessed with that mod, but I really like trying to fit things into the KW fairings. It puts a restriction on me, keeps me honest, I guess. But it's a neat challenge trying to get all the equipment and systems you need stacked within the confines of a fairing. Which, now that I have dmagic, it actually makes that a trivial exercise. Occasionally those science bay doors glitch out. You got to close and reopen them. Let everybody get a look at the guts of this thing. And with all the science experiments run, it's time to start figuring out how we're going to transmit it all back. Which, one thing that bothers me about Remote Tech 2 is that it eliminates your transmit data options from antennas, so you have to do everything piecemeal. And this one was worth showing. Shows Chuck Kerman taking the X-15 out for a test of the toroidal aerospike engine. Unfortunately, during the return, the wings ripped off, and he's forced to make an ejection, losing the aircraft. The wings fluttering down behind. However, the pilot's been saved, so that's what's important. Full flight failure cascade report. And finally, to unlock the last node of this tier that we're going to need for our Apollo program is advanced construction. Finally getting proper docking ports unlocked. Sending a small satellite to perform a multispectral scan of Kerbin, which gives all the biome data. Spoiler alert. If you don't want to see all the biomes, I guess close your eyes and listen to my soothing voice. Now, I really don't show too much of the map when it's blown up, and there are some people who don't like using this. They consider it kind of spoilery. I like it. It helps me more efficiently plan my missions, but to kind of respect people who don't want to know, I try to keep any shots of my multispectral maps pretty limited. I'm not going to care when I get to Duna because I'm using custom biomes, and all that stuff is going to be so different from what ends up in the game, most likely, that I'm really not going to worry about it. But there are several people who enjoy discovering biomes on Kerbin and the Moon, and the few bodies that have biomes in the game that just kind of look out for them and not show too much off. Finally get everything oriented correctly, and we can activate the sensor. Rather neat looking part. I don't have my orbit perfect. It takes a little longer than it otherwise would, but Honestly, I can spend more time trying to tweak my orbit so I get like single pass coverage than it takes me to just time warp through everything. But here's a quick look at the big map as done, as finished. Not a whole lot of information to be gleaned unless I was going to hover over and show you each individual biome. But once I get to this stage in the game, I usually prefer to pop this map up so I can get my terrestrial stuff handled much more easily. And so begins the Apollo program in earnest. And since I'm using the universal storage alkaline fuel cells and other type things, I actually, honest to goodness, have to launch a test flight to see what the endurance of this thing is. Because since I'm not using solar panels, my electrical generation does require resources, and if I run out of those on the flight, my poor Kerbals are up a certain creek sans propulsion. Just get this thing circularized and have everybody buckle in for the long haul while keeping one eye glued to the resources. And this really wasn't as boring as it sounds. Since TAC life support will kill warp once your resources start depleting, I just set time warp and walked away. It would pause and tell me what's what. Making sure all systems are properly set up. This would be the Apollo Service Module Block 1. We managed exactly 1 day in space before I noticed that my waste capacity was far too small. And so I just kind of extrapolated from there that I could probably get about 2 to 3 days endurance out of this spacecraft. So I just returned everybody home. Now that we have a pretty good idea of what exactly that spacecraft is capable of, it did warrant a quick redesign. I eliminated a bunch of extraneous modules because the new KW release has switched the service propulsion module to run off monopropellant, much like the real unit was, propelled by hypergolic fuels. So this is going to be our first lunar flyby mission. And since I'm pretty limited in my tech tree, I'm getting to play around with a lot of parts I normally don't toy with. Probably could have got away with a little more fuel in this transfer stage, but honestly it has plenty of Delta V. You can see I've cut an entire stack out of the universal storage parts. My reasoning for that was, instead of having 2 of each experiment, I'll be running missions where I'll be flying closer to the moon on another mission, so this just has to worry with getting high above the moon science. This will be analogous to Apollo 8. And I'm on the fence as to what I think about having the service propulsion engine running off of monopropellant. It's more scientifically accurate, and really the only complaint I can honestly muster and really can't defend too much is the aesthetics. The whole back end of the ship being white for the RCS tanks. I got so used to flying them looking a certain way that it's just strange. Which is a dumb complaint, but I guess I can't really even call it much of a complaint. But since we're running close to our time limit, just going to show the vagaries of setting up a free return mission to get these guys on their way. And should we, being fuel limited, we're going to go for maximum safety margin here. It's not a very pretty free return, but anything that works. All I need is a encounter of any sort. But with that, they're set to return home in one go.